Good evening, everyone. This is Vibhana Sheen, and I'm doing a reading from the book Messages from the Masters by Dr. Brian Weiss. Today, we are going to read from the book, chapter 9, and the topic today that we're going to start with is other dimensions. Humans always think of themselves as the only beings. This is not the case. There are many worlds and many dimensions, many more souls. There are many souls in this dimension. I am not the only one. We must be patient. That is something I never learned either. There are many dimensions. I asked her whether she had been here before, whether she had reincarnated many times. I have been to different planes at different times. Each one is a level of higher consciousness. What plane we go to depends upon how far we have progressed. There are many more people than ever before on this planet, but there are many more souls than people. This is not the only world. Souls exist in many dimensions. They are attracted to this planet in increasing numbers because our planet, one of many schools, is a very popular school. There is so much of learning here. When I talk about other dimensions, I mean other energetic states or even different level of consciousness, not necessarily other planetary systems or galaxies. Heaven can be considered another dimension since energy transformation beyond three-dimensional consciousness is undoubtedly involved. I believe that the energy of love has physical and extra physical properties and can exist in all of the various dimensions. Love is the connecting substance that unites all the dimensions and the different planes beyond the physical. Within one dimension or plane, many sub levels exist. Another way of saying this is that there are many levels in heaven. We progress stepwise along these levels as we become more and more enlightened. In one sense, we are all aliens. None of us began on this planet. This planet is more like a high school. It is not the lowest level, nor the highest. But this is a very popular school. When we graduate, we will go elsewhere. But in all of the universes, souls are all the same. Robert, a young waiter who had experienced many hardships in this current life, carried around a kind of chronic melancholy. There was very little that could produce joy in his life. He had financial problems and he tended to shy away from relationships because he had been hurt so often in his childhood. Very stoical, his face rarely betrayed his emotions. In a deep trance state, he entered a garden or tropical jungle scene. Immediately he began to cry with tears of joy and happiness. He could barely talk. Such a display of emotion was uncharacteristic for him. How do you feel? I asked him. It's just a jungle scene. It's just home, home, he responded very slowly. His voice was filled with emotion. You seem to be feeling something profound. What is it? A rejoicing. Tears continued to flow down his cheeks. He couldn't really talk, so I awakened him after a few more minutes. My hope was that he could describe more from the conscious state where the level of emotion would not be so profound and overwhelming. After a few minutes more, he had regained some of his composure. "What did you experience?" I asked. "I just saw almost a paradise like scene, real lush and shining. There was nobody else there." "Why do you think this was so emotional?" I asked, but he had difficulty answering. He was still feeling deeply moved by his experience. Finally, he began to talk, although briefly. "I feel like it's inevitable that I will be back there sometime. I get the feeling that I know I have been there before, and it's some place I'm going, so I don't want to rush anything. And I want to feel the steps." Later that week, he explained the sense of familiarity, the feeling of incredible peace and safety that he experienced during the regression. He still had difficulty finding the words to describe his visit to the paradise like jungle. This time, his difficulty was due not to the overwhelming obstacle of profound emotion, but because mere words could not do justice to the beauty, joy, and majesty of the experience. It was ineffable. I believe Robert had a spiritual experience rather than a past life memory. The intensity of his joy, coupled with the characteristics of the evoked scene, and the relative paucity of detail and progression along a lifetime, all indicate this to me. In a small way, he re experienced the joy of going home. Earth, the three-dimensional world, is not really our true home. We are spiritual beings, and our true home is a spiritual one, a timeless place that many call heaven. Chapter 10: Healers. We must share our knowledge with other people. We all have abilities far beyond what we use. You develop through relationships. There are some with higher powers who have come back with more knowledge. They will seek out those who need the development and help them. In this one room schoolhouse we call the earth, we do not learn all from our lessons simultaneously. For example, we may have already mastered the course in compassion and charity, but we may only be beginners when it comes to patience or forgiveness. We may be graduate students in faith and hope, but kindergartners in anger or nonviolence. Similarly, we may carry over skills and talents learned in earlier incarnations, skills we have mastered, yet we may be novices in other areas. We have among us many who have mastered certain courses and skills, and they are here to share their knowledge with us, the students. In other areas, our roles may reverse. Thus, we are all teachers and we are all students, and we must share our knowledge with each other. Many physicians have chosen to be doctors in order to manifest their healing abilities, to help and to teach others. Conversely, a wise physician will always be open to learning from his or her patients. The patient might be able to teach the physician about love, about courage, about inner peace, or any of the other lessons we are here to learn. Both physicians and the patient benefit. Late one afternoon, a patient of mine came into her session complaining of an infected tetanus shot. Her arm was swollen, hot, painful, and hard in the area of the shot. She had just met her internist in the hallway of the hospital on her way to my office. He instructed her to come to this office the next morning in order to begin a course of antibiotic treatment. Those things needs antibiotics, he had said, or else they get worse. I decided to try helping her with hypnosis. She quickly drifted into a deep hypnotic state, and I instructed her to bring healing light to the affected area of her arm. I had her visualize an increased blood flow to the infection, cleaning the area, carrying away damaged cells, and eliminating damaging bacteria. She vividly imagined healthy new cells and the complete absence of disease. By the end of the session, the pain had disappeared and the infected area was not as hot. I was not surprised because hypnosis has long been used as a technique to diminish pain. By bedtime, the swollen area was only half as large. By the next morning, her arm had entirely returned to normal, and there was no evidence of an infection. She went to her physician anyway. "What happened to your arm?" he exclaimed. "Those things never clear up on their own." "It must have been a spontaneous remission," she answered, keeping her secret. She knew he could accept that explanation. He was close minded to alternative or complementary medicine. If she had said she was healed through guided imagery under hypnosis, he would have scoffed. No remission of illness is truly spontaneous. We may not be consciously aware of the underlying mechanisms, but strong healing forces have been secretly at work healing the damage. I knew Dr. Bernie Siegel long before he became the well-known author of several miraculous books about the mind-body connection. Love, Medicine, and Miracles and Peace, Love and Healing are two of his international bestsellers. Bernie was an attending surgeon at Yale New Haven Hospital in private practice in New Haven, Connecticut, when I was a medical student at Yale on my surgery rotation in the late 1960s. I chose to observe and assist the private surgeons because they were generally faster and funnier than the full-time academic staff who tended to be more authoritarian, didactic, and rigid. Bernie and his associate Dr. Richard Selger, who has also written several popular books, were especially funny. Their patients were not the only ones who wound up in stitches. The surgeons made jokes, recited risk poetry, told stories, and vignettes. These were really funny guys. In addition, both were excellent technical surgeons, and I learned a lot about surgery. At this time, none of us realized that some patients, even though they were under general anesthesia, were also listening to the conversations, jokes, and bantering. We know this now. I spoke to Bernie recently after he had conducted a workshop in Miami. We decided that the jokes and bantering at that time were okay. At the worst, the patient might have felt some concern, thinking, "Dr. Siegel, why are you joking? Pay more attention to my body. This is important to me." Better that the patient overhear his surgeon making jokes then giving dire and calamitous predictions about the patient's chances or speculating about permanent disabilities the surgery may cause. Such pronouncements might convince the patient to give up rather than to face enormous obstacles and handicaps. There is a more profound chemistry for physicians to experience than those found in blood tests and laboratories. Many physicians are so busy, stressed, self absorbed, afraid, or greedy that they do not take the time to listen to their patients, to have a relationship with their patients. This is a tragic state of affairs, both for the physician and the patient. The physician denies himself or herself the satisfaction of knowing the patient on a personal basis and loses the opportunity to learn from a therapeutic encounter. Without the real gratification that comes from a person to person connection, the practice of medicine becomes sterile and mechanistic. The physician begins to feel constantly rushed and behind schedule. Depression and early burnout are common results. The patient also feels rushed and uncared for, of interest merely as an illness for an organ, or even worse as a dollar to the doctor rather than as a whole person or even as a friend. The patient's dignity and humanity are eroded. All physicians can be deeply touched if they take the time to listen to and to learn from their patients. Many doctors have told me about their more unusual cases, cases that have been touched upon areas not yet taught in medical schools. An eminent plastic surgeon in the Miami area told me about a most remarkable case. Months had passed, but the surgeon's face his amazement. A patient of his had been involved in a serious automobile accident. She had sustained massive head trauma, facial fractures, and other internal injuries. Although emergency surgery had been scheduled, the patient was not expected to live. As the surgeon was preparing the family for the inevitably fatal outcome, the patient floated out of her body. Although the family doctor conference was taking place in a part of the hospital far away from the medical team was working on her injuries, she found them and overheard the conversation, helplessly watching her family's grief and despair. She looked down from her ethereal body. "I'm not dead," she yelled, but nobody seemed to hear her. Frustrated that her cries went unheard and angry that her family was being told she would die, she floated back to her physical body. With the help of excellent medical care combined with the strength of her will to survive, she had what the doctor called a miraculous recovery. Nobody recovers from injuries like hers, he kept saying. Later on, she was able to repeat the conversation the doctor had had with her family. Not only had she avoided physical death, but she was somehow able to accelerate the healing process dramatically. Her bones and tissues mended at many times normal speed. An elderly lady, blind from diabetes, suffered a cardiac arrest during her stay in the hospital, where I was the chairman of the psychiatry department. She was unconscious as the resuscitation team tried to revive her. According to her later report, she floated out of her body and stood near the window, watching as the doctors administered medicines through hastily inserted intravenous tubes. She observed, without any pain whatsoever, as they thumped on her chest and pumped air into her lungs. During the resuscitation, a pen fell out of her doctor's pocket and rolled near the same window where her was standing and watching. The doctor eventually walked over, picked up the pen, and put it back in his pocket. He then rejoined the frantic effort to save her. They succeeded. A few days later, she told her doctor that she had observed the resuscitation team at work during her cardiac arrest. No, he soothingly assured her. You probably were hallucinating because of anoxia, which is lack of oxygen to the brain. This can happen when the heart stops beating. But I saw your pen roll over the window, she replied. Then she described the pen and other details of the process. The doctor was shocked. His patient had not only been comatose during the resuscitation, but she had also been blind for many years. We have more ways to see than only with our eyes. One of the hospital's doctors called me in to see a patient of his who had awakened screaming and highly agitated in the recovery room following major surgery. She had been given general anesthesia and was hence unconscious throughout the procedure, and her breathing was controlled by the anesthesiologist. During the surgery, the surgeons had experienced some difficulty with her blood pressure and heart rhythm. During the surgery, she had floated above the surgeons working on her body. The patient became alarmed when her blood pressure and heart rhythm became abnormal. She noted the concern in the anesthesiologist's voice and floated over to him and read his notations on her chart. Upon awakening in the recovery room, panicked because of these abnormalities, she was able to tell me what had been written on her chart during the surgical procedure. The patient was unconscious throughout the procedure. Yet, even if she had awakened, she would not have had the opportunity to see her chart. The anesthesiologist was writing in back of her, a yard or so behind her head. An emergency room physician at a nearby hospital stood in line at a book signing for more than 30 minutes to tell me this story. A patient of his had experienced the sudden onset of anaphylactic shock after she was stung by a bee. This is a potentially lethal allergic reaction that causes a massive drop in blood pressure. Even though heroic life-saving measures had been started when she entered the emergency room, the doctor was convinced that the patient was dying. This patient later reported that she had floated alongside her own body as she was wheeled into the hospital. She overheard and later repeated all of the discussions, the barking of orders, the swearing, the expectations, and the anxious remarks of the emergency room staff. She saw their faces, their clothes, and who was doing what, even though she was comatose. She also had a miraculous recovery, and the doctor later validated the accuracy of her observations and her recall of the events and conversations, some of which took place in different rooms. I have heard these and other stories of clinical accounts of patients with near death and out of body experiences from so many physicians that I cannot explain them away on medical or physiological grounds. These are highly educated, logical, and skeptical doctors, rigorously trained in medical schools. All were telling me that beyond a doubt, their patient, although unconscious, had left their bodies and heard and observed events at a distance. I no longer believe that these events are rare. Most patients are reluctant to tell their doctors because they are afraid that the doctor will assume that they had been hallucinating or think them strange or crazy. Why take the risk? And why should the doctors take the risk of sharing these experiences? Many psychiatrists have been afraid to talk in public about their experiences with regressions. I have had phone calls and letters from hundreds of psychiatrists and thousands more physiologists, social workers, hypnotherapists, clinicians, and other therapists telling me that they have been doing regressions to past lives in the privacy of my office or in secret without telling any of my colleagues for the past 5 or 10 or sometimes 20 years. Here are clinical accounts, many of which can be validated and confirmed. More proof. The letters describe detailed accounts of past life recall, of patients recalling names, dates, and details of lifetimes in other cities, countries, or even continents. Some patients have found their old names in the official records of places they have never heard of, let alone visit in this lifetime. Some have found their own tombstones. The risk of going public is potentially severe. Doctors fear that their hard earned reputations, their practices, the security of their families, even their social relationships will all be jeopardized. I understand the trepidation. It took me years to gather the courage to publish my findings. Yet it is because they are credible that physicians have the opportunity to reinforce these truths by coming forward with their findings. In doing so, they can benefit millions of people and they can also benefit themselves. Sharing truths, whether about out of body and near death experiences, cases of unusual or example of past life memories and therapy, is just as important as sharing information on traditional medical research. The more we know, the more people we can help. Moreover, in learning these truths through their own patients and experiences, physicians will feel happier and more satisfied and fulfilled in their personal and professional lives. I know I have been there. Most of the stories from physicians are about near death experiences and out of body experiences. It is less likely that they would be in a position to encounter past life experiences. This makes sense. However, because physicians are often treating very ill patients, whether people have OBE, NDE, or past life experience, the healing that occurs is similar. Patients often find that their lives have been transformed in a positive way. Physical and emotional healing may be dramatically accelerated. The element common to all these experiences is the existence of the consciousness beyond the physical body or brain. This consciousness is expanded upon leaving the physical body. Colors and sounds are more vivid. The purpose of our soul's journey becomes more clear. Our spiritual nature is manifest. And in those moments we understand we are immortal beings of wisdom, infinite love and compassion. Paradoxically, during this seeming separation, the mind body connection seems to be strengthened or at least a bit more in our control. Healing occurs as the mind, through its awareness and will, sends energy to those parts of our body that need repair. For centuries, many Asian cultures, including the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, have recognized the healing energies and currents that course through our bodies. They have worked with these energies and even mapped out the characteristics of energy flow or intensity. The Chinese called this energy Shi or Qi, the Japanese Ki. These cultures have fostered experts on the mind body connection, and I have been fortunate enough to work with some of them. On two separate occasions, I have had the opportunity to regress physicians from mainland China. Both were also masters of energy work and healing. The first doctor was the subject of a study at the physics department at New York University. The university asked me to be a liaison since I was a physician who was well known in China, where my books have been bestsellers. The Chinese physician spoke no English, so we worked with an interpreter. Curious whether my techniques were similar to those of the master with whom he had studied as a youth, he asked that we attempt a regression. He slipped into a deep hypnotic state and experienced an interesting past life memory. Afterwards, he commented that our techniques were indeed very similar. Then he asked if I had seen and experienced his past life scenes as if we were watching the same movie together. No, I answered. Sometimes I get premonitions of what is going to happen, but I don't actually see what is happening in your mind. A pity, he replied through the interpreter. My master could. On the other occasion, a famous Chinese physician visited me in Miami and demonstrated a powerful Qi Gong healing. In return, she requested a past life regression, and I agreed. She also spoke no English, but she traveled with a translator. She went under very deeply. Within a few minutes, she was vividly recalling a past life scene in San Francisco more than 100 years ago. She began speaking fluent English during the recall. The interpreter, a trained professional, did not miss a beat. He immediately turned to me and began translating into Chinese. I stared at him for a moment and then pointed out that he did not need to do that. The shocked look on his face conveyed his realization. He knew she could not speak a word of English. Psychoanalysis and psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapies are in their death throes. Techniques are outmoded, slow, and ineffective. Language has become encrusted, formalized, impenetrable. There is no blood in psychotherapy these days. Just arid and monolithic structure, dust. Not enough people can be reached, especially one at a time. And to even these few, the worn out, agonizingly slow, cold, and distant approach of these therapies will not suffice. One neurosis is replaced by another in traditional therapy. Outward functioning, not inner peace and joy, is the measure of success. There is no transformation of the individual or of society. The economic disintegration is evident. People cannot afford the 50-minute hour 4 to 6 times a week to anywhere from 3 to 15 years. Most cannot even afford to come in weekly. Insurance policies and managed care are drastically limiting payments. Freud and his disciples made important contributions to our understanding of the functioning of the mind, the existence of the unconscious, childhood sexuality, and to dream analysis. But psychoanalysis has no spiritual roots and cannot release the spiritual nature of humans. Freud may not have seen his theory as terminal, but his disciples set him in on stone. Jung was a maverick and ahead of his time. He understood the mysterious, the spiritual, the supernatural. But he was surrounded by those chiseling in stone. One major flaw of psychoanalysis and related traditional psychotherapy is the concept of ego repair. The ego is the I, the execution function, the part of us that has to integrate and deal with everyday reality. It is our ordinary or everyday mind. The everyday mind is logical, rational, which has to make decisions, uses thoughts and memory, plans for and worries about the future, and broods about the past. It is always making judgments, putting thoughts in our minds, reviewing the data of the past, asking questions like but, suppose, and what if. Unfortunately, most psychotherapists are constantly trying to repair our damaged egos. Our egos gets bruised as they see it by our critical and dysfunctional parents, our childhood traumas, our inescapable physical limitations as an infant, and so on. These therapists are always soothing or repairing or even hyperinflating our egos. In truth, we must learn to go beyond our egos. But surely we will fall apart. How can we function and survive without our egos, our everyday mind in control? The answer is very simple. Traditional therapists are stuck in the illusion that functioning is the ultimate goal, but inner peace and joy are actually much more important. If we can gradually decrease our concern with functioning and fitting into our sync society, with acquiring things and worrying about what other people are thinking about us, then we can gradually begin to increase our joy. Our mind traps us in past and in the future, constantly worrying, analyzing and thinking. Our egos prevent us from truly being in the present, from climbing out of the rut of habit and conditioning. How can we see things as they really exist in the present when our past conditioning and assumptions, our preconceived ideas, biases, and prejudice are constantly getting in our way? We must control this ego in order to save ourselves and ultimately our world. Psychoanalysis is essentially unspiritual. It is a sterile discipline. It teaches nothing about immortality, the survival of the soul after physical death, about the real values in life. It stops short of the real questions and issues. When it does work, it is because the therapist connects with the patient on a truly caring, compassionate level. The relationship is what heals. Biological psychiatry often too falls short. The new medicines to treat depression, mood swings, and psychotic states are means to an end, not the end itself. Too many psychiatrists prescribe medications and do nothing else. This is a tremendous waste. The medicines can help to make the patient accessible to the psycho spiritual therapy that must then take place. To leave out the therapy is to leave out the entire essence of the treatment. In addition, there are problems with most of the hundreds of self help books out there. I wish therapy was so simple, a quick fix, but it is not. To reach a happy, satisfied life and a joyful state is difficult. To maintain the state once reached is even more challenging. It is hard work to stay out of the rut, to search within, to truly understand oneself, to foster a sense of detachment and perspective. These are difficult tasks and they require patience and much practice. The journey is arduous and long, but well worth it. To be truly happy requires an understanding of life and of death and a loving, forgiving spiritual nature. Introspection, meditation, loving service, kindness, and charity. These are some of the steps along the way. Practicing forgiveness of yourself and others, non-violence and good deeds, working to eliminate anger, fear, greed, self centeredness, and false pride. These are yet more steps. This brings me to the end of the book reading session today. We will continue with the same chapter tomorrow, sometime around 7 o'clock tomorrow evening. Till then, this is Vibha Nashin signing off. Take care. Good night.